Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for joining us here at the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership's 2025 annual conference on the road to Lexington and Concord, the making of imperial crisis and the making of American political order. We've had a good lineup this morning of an opening keynote and panels before and after lunch, and now we are going to round out our Friday session with a keynote conversation. And we are delighted to have with us today two distinguished scholars for a conversation on Thomas Jefferson. Annette Gordon Reed is the Carl M. Loeb University Professor at Harvard University. She's won 16 book prizes, including the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award for The Hemingses of Monticello, An American Family, in 2008. Gordon Reed has served as the 2018-2019 president of the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. And her honors include fellowships from the Guggenheim and MacArthur Foundations and the National Humanities Medal. She has also been held the prestigious Harmsworth Professorship in American History at Oxford University. Peter Onuf, the Thomas Jefferson Foundation Professor Emeritus at the University of Virginia, is a specialist in the history of the early American Republic, with a focus on Thomas Jefferson and his political thought. Onuf's many books include Jefferson's Empire, The Language of American Nationhood in 2000, Jefferson and the Virginians, Democracy, Constitution, and Empire in 2018, and with his co-author, Annette Gordon Reed, Most Blessed of the Patriarchs, Thomas Jefferson and the Empire of Imagination in 2016. I have to say that both of our speakers have held the Harmsworth Professorship at Oxford University. Indeed, this has turned into a reunion of former Harmsworth chairs and a pre-union for an upcoming Harmsworth chair. So this has been quite the gathering today. So we're very glad to have everyone with us, and we are especially glad to have Annette Gordon Reed and Peter Onuf to speak on Thomas Jefferson in a World at War.
Thanks, Will. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you, Will and Janelle and SCETL, for this opportunity to spend time with fellow Harmsworth professors and to spend time with you all. It is a treat. And the sessions have been really interesting. We've been listening attentively. And what we want to do is to situate our man and rethink him in real time as we contemplate this road. And I think when the book is published, it will be called something else. This quagmire on the way to roads in the plural at least. Anyway, we want to put Jefferson in that context and to read him in that context. And if the demand is sufficient and the applause is sustained, we'll write another book.
Oh, I don't
just joking. Depends on what kind of advance you're collectively prepared to make. Anyway, we're going to use that as a conceit or a way in. I thought Jeremy started the day beautifully by reminding us of all the crises, all the contingencies, and that sense that 1763 or 1760 with the inauguration of, or the crowning coronation of George II, sorry, I'm an American, and 1763 with the Peace of Paris, when Anglo-Americans were thrilled to be part of this great expansive empire of liberty. And one of the big takeaways this morning is the reluctance to get to next year, that is to independence itself, which was shared by our subjects. And that's very hard for us to suspend our knowledge of what happens next in the Declaration. But I think Jane Calvert shows us with Dickinson, if you hold back from independence and say, how did they get there, then you might look at things differently. New pathways might emerge instead of that road. Or if we thought in even broader popular terms, many, many pathways, because it's not one or two or three or four great, truly dead white guys who made this thing. It was an exercise of massive mobilization on an unprecedented scale in the Western world. And when we're looking for the sources of what becomes reluctantly American independence, what should we take into account? Now, that notion of a world in constant crisis, multiple places where British policymakers, if we can even call them policymakers in any serious way, faced enormous existential risks. And the Americans themselves knew that nothing was sure going forward. The notion that the revolutionaries had that republicanism was a massive experiment and it could fail. We need to recover that to better understand the founding period of American history. So, Annette, I'd like to open this question with some goals in mind that as we chart out this volume on the young Jefferson, how does he look different to you, to us, as we contemplate him in this world that seems much less fixed and certain? Because it's been part of the national narrative. We come from one place and go to another, the arc of history, the road to Concord.
Well, as you're indicating, he wasn't thinking at the time, as the young Jefferson wouldn't have been thinking of being separate from the British Empire. He was a part of it, and he wanted to be a part of it. And he saw himself as part of the mission of the empire. And what gets disrupted is even before they get to the point of thinking about independence, is just any kind of possible change in the relations between the two of them. Mm-hmm. The British efforts to reform meant that they had to think about things differently. He has to think about all of the people in place in Virginia differently. Enslaved people, indigenous people, even the lower class, we wouldn't have said class, but the poor people in Virginia, people not non-gentry people, everybody looks different. The world is put in motion in a different way as they start to think about these kinds of things. And that had to be unsettling to him at one time, in one sense, but also an exciting prospect. If you're not thinking of independence, you're thinking about maybe carving out a different way of going forward. But I can't imagine that he didn't think that they were going to go, at first, that they were going to go forward together, but perhaps on different terms. So it puts everything in motion in ways that had not existed before.
Well, how about Virginia? The idea that he comes from the Old Dominion. Virginians like to cultivate this idea that they were an essential part and had a deep history in the English and British world. How did Jefferson really feel about Virginia?
Well,
be honest.
Be honest? Not too thrilled. I mean, he had a sense of himself, and this is all a part of all the biographies of him at William and Mary, dining with the governor and his teachers and so forth, being somewhat separate from other people. He saw himself as a figure of the Enlightenment, a person who was a devotee of that. And he didn't think that the upper class, certainly not the upper classes of Virginia, were people who had similar views. He looked down on them.
You mean you wouldn't talk about a Virginia Enlightenment?
No. No, but I think he began to think that there was a way of doing that, but I don't think he thought that the Virginia gentry would be part of would be the people who would be leading it. He would be a part of it, but he and a few enlightened people could perhaps improve the lot of ordinary people, the people whom he's beginning to construct as the people who are going to carry things forward.
Well, let's start with a brief overview. We want to situate him in a world at war, and of course Virginia had been involved in the 7 Years' War and in the aftermath. What are some of the things that we might cite about Virginia society that are less attractive? We'll culminate with a discussion of slavery.
Well, that would be the first thing that I would think, but that I would think about. I mean, slavery, it is a place where, he says the buildings are bad,
Yeah.
the architecture is bad, people are not as well read as they should be. Religion, something had to be done about religion, that there's a possibility that the gentry might consolidate power and create sort of an aristocracy that could not be dislodged. And so it's not a place that, for a person who sees himself as forward thinking, that it's immediately apparent that this is the place where that could take place, that would actually happen.
So we might describe him as a Creole born in the province with aspirations and ambitions that can't be contained by the province. What are his horizons? How would you describe his?
Well, it's books. For a time he thinks about maybe going to Great Britain, that make the traveling there. He dreamed about doing that. It doesn't actually make the trip, but the revolution interrupts that. The revolution. I mean, the beginnings of the problems interrupt that, and he has to think about ways that he might make a contribution in Virginia, as a constitution maker, perhaps, legislator, doing those kinds of things, that he could affect things through, first through law as a lawyer. And our colleague, El Jefe, David Koenig, has written about Jefferson as a lawyer and trying to do something about the institution of slavery, one case at a time, in that sense. He has a vision of himself as a progressive person who has forward thinking on certain issues. We look at it now, and it's interesting because that would not be the way we would characterize him, but that's certainly how he saw himself during this period, just before the revolution, that he is a part of a vanguard of forward-thinking people who are going to make changes in law, in property rights, all those kinds of things, and even the institution of slavery.
But would you call him a man of the people?
No.
So let's talk about that a little bit. You might say that his ambitious reading into what historians call the Republic of Letters, to become part of a larger world, interestingly defined by the term republic, to become part of a worldwide phenomenon. And so yes, improvement and progress, that's what he's imagining. Lots could be done, and it's hard to get to the depths of how ugly old regime Virginia was. And I think that's an important point to take away. There is a provincial old regime, the idea that somehow Anglo-America had achieved a level of civility and political maturity, had grown up with that old trope of the child ready to burst the shackles of childhood and be recognized as an adult. The sleazy business of, everything sleazy about slavery doesn't adequately sum it up. But the dismal swamp that Charlie Royster wrote about at tedious length, all the insider dealings, the corruption, it's interesting that corruption and vice and luxury were displaced to the metropolis, but the metropolis had been the way out for somebody like Jefferson. I mean, one of the things that we want to explore are continuities. Now that we've disrupted the traditional narrative, we're thinking differently about independence. It's not that these provinces secede in order to create a new world. There are many things about the New World that are continuous. We talked about the idea of empire. Jefferson is certainly an imperial thinker as well. So that notion of unpredictability, he's an enlightened man. He can identify with enlightened Europeans and enlightened Anglo-Americans and imagine improvement. And that would have to do with how does that idea of Jefferson as a Democrat become part of his persona? That strikes me as we've talked about tensions. He's not a man of the people. We agree on that.
He's not a man of the people. Compared to the people who were his opponents, you could say that he had a vision for the people, and he had a vision for them, The time we're talking about, I don't think that he may have had that sense of himself as someone who could walk with all types of people and deal with all kinds of people. Jefferson, the Democrat, I think this is largely something that comes later on, don't you think?
Well, that's retrospective.
It's retrospective. I mean, but certainly the time we're talking about, this is before he has to do any of that, has to think about things in that way. He could have a notion of an elite that would be leading, a sort of an enlightened elite who would be leading the people in Virginia. They could participate, but the Jefferson of 1800, the Jefferson that emerges after the 1790s, that's not born yet at the time that we're talking about, because there's no reason to do it. I mean, he's part of a monarchy, and there's an order, a settled order that he's a part of, and he accepts that settled order. Once that's gone away, then he realized he has to conceive of society in a different fashion, and that's when it's important for him to become the apostle of liberty or whatever.
Right. It's the world is at war. What is that? Yeah. No.
I'm stepping in and I'm pulling us a little bit ahead, but Annette's point about the young Jefferson and before, what does Jefferson's exposure, and I'm asking this to highlight the young Jefferson, but what does Jefferson's exposure to poverty and to inequality in Europe mean to his thinking? Because when he travels to France, he sees opulence, he sees culture. He goes from a provincial fringe to the center of things. But Paris and France was the middle kingdom of old regime Europe, right? But he also sees gross inequality, but not just inequality, but poverty, material deprivation.
Well, he sees poor white people,
yeah.
or people he would construct as white. Surely there would have been enslaved people who were living in conditions that were pretty bad. There were some Virginians who were living in pretty bad conditions. But the idea of perhaps the contrast, as you're saying, the difference between, Chantilly or Chambord and, the hovels that he describes the peasants living in, the gap is just so wide that it really
it's shocking.
It's shocking to him. Because they're poor people, beggars. Yep. Maybe not as many beggars, with in urban areas and things like that are very shocking to him. I think it's the contrast that gets to him.
We need to remember the degree of metropolitan contempt for provincial Anglo-Americans, to the extent they mattered at all, and of course that contempt, they were vulgar, they were acquisitive. I mean, these were things that were deeply disturbing to ambitious provincials who knew that some of this contempt was well earned.
No.
And it's from the perspective of Europe, after this whole thing has been launched, America looks a lot better. The scale of things, the relative equality up front in his personal experience, I think he finds old regime Virginia somewhat demoralizing. It's in need of renewal. His commitment to the revisal of the laws, to doing something about old regime Virginia, and that includes conspicuously preempting the concentration of landed wealth through modification of the inheritance laws, a broad distribution of wealth to keep things as they were as long as possible. Because in that context, looking from Europe, he sees great potential, but that potential had become visible to him very early in life, at a formative period. And that's what I'd like to emphasize here. I'm going to argue a little tendentiously that Jefferson is almost a class traitor, a sort of wannabe aristocrat who's disgusted by his peers, a bunch of cockfighting, drunken, nasty, smelly people. People did smell in those days. They drink too much. And the idea of some kind of moral renewal, we've heard about that with the Methodists on both sides of the Atlantic. There's a powerful call for this, a call for renewal and moral revival. It's in that context of being the ambitious young provincial who hangs out with the royal governor and when you reach the top, and you young people here, you're close to the top now, and it must be really exhilarating, but you're actually, you're having string quartets with Donald Trump. No, that doesn't work quite well, but you get my point. You've reached the peak. Talk about a small pond, a small smelly pond. So I think Jefferson, in some sense, has internalized and shares the contempt that that metropolitans display. But there is this moment in 1765, I'll set it up for you, Annette, a transformative moment, even dare I say it, a tipping point? That's for you. Yeah, Patrick. A tipping point for Jefferson when he begins to think, aha, maybe the people maybe there's something to the people after all. Maybe, or better yet, maybe there's something to those younger guys who were in the House of Burgesses. Maybe there's something about, and this is for Jefferson, this is a big, big, big admission. Maybe there's something to say for Patrick Henry, of all people.
You know, who can inspire people.
Yeah.
That there's a spirit that can be drawn upon that could help remake society in a way. And that would be the engine for all of this, appealing to people's sense of a version of patriotism, patriotism of love and of your country. And that's how you could move forward. I mean, he doesn't, like Patrick Henry, he says he couldn't remember anything that he said, 2 hours after he said it, but the feeling that he was able to evoke with his oratory and his speeches and so forth was something that he admired, and that would be something to draw upon. I mean, if you think about the moment at which things began to go awry with Great Britain, and he is in this position of being a person who sees himself as enlightened and perhaps a leader, everything looks different. The society looks different. Enslaved people look different. Indigenous people look different. And now there's a possibility of actually doing things. I mean, the kind of highfalutin Enlightenment theories, things that he would talk about in letters, there's an opportunity to perhaps enact things, there's a practical aspect to it as well. So I think it puts things in motion in a way that doesn't inexorably lead to independence, but it's a way of thinking about the world in a different way.
I think we're learning that all the key terms that we deploy analytically are words and in progress. They don't mean what they mean today. And I think that's really important. Democracy is for us, or it used to be foundational. We take it for granted. It's the air we breathe. But democracy is at best a neutral term used to describe a limited swath of the population, or it's often pejorative.
Or scary.
So the idea that the people are out of doors and you better close the door because you don't want them to pollute your refined atmosphere. That contempt for the people and for what critics of revivals called enthusiasm, sort of the pathology of a revived religion, that people are acting in unpredictable ways. They're defying social order. Elite Americans aspire for a more hierarchical society. And that's the long arc of what we call Anglicization, becoming more English. And it's a curious phenomenon that this, fueled by the consumer revolution, that Americans are able to live better and aspire to a better way of life. To escape male drunkenness is one, to drink tea heterosocially, it's really cool. These are all learned behaviors at the elite level. And the idea of the people, not so good, but when Jefferson sees that the door should be opened and you can speak, and rather than condemning the people for being animals, for being lesser forms of human beings, for being savage, living by their passions and their appetites, we imagine now that the people, I think this is a key insight, the people are educable. That is, they can respond to the right plain speech about the right things that are close to their hearts, the things that matter to them, we have something in common. And all of a sudden, all the highfalutin notions from Scottish moral philosophy start to seem, well, yeah, maybe they do apply here. I want to just add, when I say that, you'd think that suddenly it is all that reading that made Jefferson this enlightened guy. It's in the context of what seemed to be those crises that Jeremy was talking about, that is, that world at war. You need to turn to the people. In that episode about Patrick Henry, you turn to Patrick Henry because the older generation that dominates the House of Burgesses, and they're not ready to take a strong stand on the Stamp Act, but Henry sets them right. And Jefferson suddenly glimpses the possibility that the younger generation, the new people, the younger people, maybe they're not lost to the world yet. Maybe they're not involved in all the rampant corruption in Williamsburg. Maybe there's some hope. That wedge, generational thinking, along with what you might call the transvaluation of values, all of a sudden the people are okay. Maybe they're possible. We're going to have to mobilize these people. That's not a word that I've heard this morning. People haven't talked about mobilization. If tipping points mean anything, it's when the feet hit the ground, when people move, they do things, they act together. I think, and I'll risk again offending my theorist friends, Michael, don't listen to this. I think if you're looking for the sources of American democracy, I'm all for natural rights. Really, I love them. I wish we really had them. No, those ideas are important because they're powerful abstractions that can be deployed. But what really matters and what gives democracy its American meaning is the mobilization of ordinary folk.
Mm-hmm. And he believes that, he continues to believe that the rest of his life. I mean, he's mobilized forever. I mean, certainly the 1790s he's mobilized. Even when he's in retirement at Monticello, the idea is how do you gather people together to inspire people to take action, to do various things. So, I said in the Hemmingses at one point, and I wanted to use the footnote to the Talking Heads, the song Life During Wartime. Jefferson was like in wartime constantly. I mean, he never comes down from what he learns during the period before the Revolution, that this is how you change things. And he brings that sensibility, I think, to everything, until, as I said, until he leaves the planet.
The mobilization you are both pointing to, which is very, very important here, I think, it's looking to a direction, and that direction, Peter's just referred to the Scottish moral philosophers, the idea of a transition from rudeness to refinement. Mm-hmm. And what you're both reminding us of is that the world of Virginia, and I'll hint to later on to talk about some of the other colonies as well, this is a world that is pretty rude. Mm-hmm. Even among the elites, it's a rougher and ruder world than we realize. And so the development of politeness in the colonies and the potential that raises.
Or education just in general. I mean, the idea that you were saying, Peter, that they can be made better, and that's the thrust of public education and what it's supposed to be about. I mean, I'm sure he didn't imagine that they would all become like him, but certainly enough of an education that they could participate, that mobilize intelligently, mobilize as in a democracy in a way that's effective.
Yeah, the cultural dimension would be civility, manners, politeness, absolutely for those who aspire to a higher level. It's recognizing what you may say, the kind of vernacular civility, common sense. All of these terms are inclusionary terms. And perhaps the most important thing about mobilization is discipline. This may be the heart of the democratic paradox. Mobilized in war to risk and lose your life in order to achieve a collective good whose benefits may not be felt for generations. This is quite extraordinary. Deferred gratification, enlightened self-interest, disciplined willingness to die. This is what I'd like to emphasize about Jefferson and democracy, is that his democracy emerges in Jeremy Black's world. No, he wasn't there yet. He must have been close to there for all the books that he's written. Jeremy, are you still here? Is he gone?
No, he's,
I'd see, because he's not here anyway. Jefferson's democracy is a democracy that emerges it's not won by the war, it emerges and grows out of the war. The idea of solidarities, of the natural attraction of Republicans to each other, a nice trope, those ideas are all based on the foundation of the collective sacrifices that people are prepared to make for the common cause. That's where democracy comes from. And if you think of it in those terms, then the contested category, it is struggle. And that struggle is a struggle against enemies. And they're all over the place. So Jack has organized a volume about exclusionary empire, talking about what the British Empire is like, and the American empire is an exclusionary empire. It is simultaneously, of course, inclusionary in significant ways. And that notion of a citizen body emerging from the crucible of conflict and facing existential threats in all quarters. And maybe that's a good transition to talking about what I think is one of the major ideas to emerge from the revolutionary period, and which we can to some extent attribute to people like Jefferson, is the idea of a people. Something we take for granted, or we used to, the idea that Americans constitute a people. That's not an idea that goes time out of mind in our sense of the word.
no, and it's particularly problematic here and for him because who are those people? Are black people part of those people? Indigenous people? They can become a part of the people if they're assimilated and sort of disappeared genetically out of it. So I mean, having sort of thought about that notion or raised that as something that's important, it's significant that they're in a place, unlike Great Britain. I guess Great Britain has its slavery overseas. Here, he's living in a place where 40% of the people are of African descent in his state. How do you constitute a people there? How do you simultaneously talk about emancipation and at the same time, what are you going to do with these people? And we know what his answer is. They got to go, essentially. At some point, he probably near the end of his life, he realizes that this is a dim prospect, that this is not likely going to happen. But that becomes a real American problem, thinking about things, for him too, thinking about it as the people. Who could that be in a place where you have different kinds of people? What kinds of affection, bonds of affection can you have? What kind of solidarity can you have? Particularly when, in times of war, when this group of people are potential enemies. They're seen as potential enemies. And can they ever come together? And his answer in the notes is no, they can't.
Edmund Burke's comment that Americans talking about slavery, their language has an edge to it because many of them live amongst slavery. Your point, Annette, that 40% of slaves in Virginia, that if you live amongst enslaved people, you have a different understanding of what that term means, what that concept is, than someone who is looking back to antiquity.
And the notion of the people becomes much more complicated because how do they fit? And he couldn't find a way to do that.
Well, to some extent, then a working dynamic definition of the people of Virginia and the American people emerges in dialogue with or in contrast to the recognition that enslaved people collectively constitute a people. That's the dark mirror of American self-consciousness because that's the enemy in your own midst.
And you have to take care of that. Once they start to move away from Great Britain and they start thinking about independence, he understands that this is a problem they're going to have to deal with because it is then their responsibility at that point. Before, I mean, it's a part of the British Empire. It's an imperial problem, and now it becomes a local, for them, a problem of America.
The backstop is now gone.
Yeah.
That empire provided a backstop in many ways. And you've just described an issue where, at least implicitly, this is the backstop, that we can rely for security upon the crown. Now we are separate from the crown. We must rely on ourselves. And what does that mean?
Well, and you have the paradox that in the name of freedom, you're breaking away from the empire because you faced what you saw was imminent enslavement yourselves, losing your liberties. But slavery is a transnational institution. It's a British imperial institution. British credit fuels it. British markets consume staple products from slave plantations. Any solution to the slavery problem has to be transatlantic in scope. And breaking away from the empire means that Americans have made the slavery solution all the more difficult. Because key members of this emerging union, which must be made more perfect to guarantee collective security, are going to insist on the protection of their slave property. I wonder, with that in mind, that is, with the idea that, and I don't want to push this too hard, slavery has got a robust future in any case, to me, obviously. But I don't think Jefferson's totally wrong in his draft of the Declaration in which he suggests that it's King George III's fault. It's a way of talking about the institution as a transatlantic institution. So the scope of this new regime is going to be one that's going to be defined by its commitment to slavery. With that in mind, and I'm not saying Jefferson therefore is responsible for the expansion of slavery in the new United States, though he's right up there in those responsible. I talked before about continuities, about the young Jefferson who has his misgivings about, and sincere misgivings, as David Conant has argued persuasively, about the institution. He's anti-slavery. He gets credit for that by his contemporaries, at least through the Revolutionary period, not later necessarily. What happens to the young Jefferson? We could describe him as somebody who has mixed feelings about his neighbors. I've called him a class traitor. That's obviously hyperbole, but he has concerns about the morality and the ethics of his fellow whites. One of the things he's embarrassed about is these provinces, Anglo-American provinces, don't have the stratified, well-articulated, hierarchical social orders that constitute the model of good societies. So the idea that defect, the lack of articulation, lack of hierarchy, can be seen as an asset in a time when you need to mobilize human resources, I think that's fundamental to the emergence of the modern idea of democracy. So there are a lot of, if we're not awarding stars to Jefferson, we don't want to rehabilitate him, don't get us wrong, but what about Jefferson's world as it changes from the young provincial, ambitious to make his world better, looking beyond Virginia in hopes that Virginia can become a more enlightened place? What does independence do to the young Virginian? And you might want to talk about his record on race and slavery.
Well, I mean, as I was alluding to before, it's a problem now that he and fellow leaders have to solve. But there's also the issue of maintaining the revolution, a particular idea of the revolution. And to me, and we can, I'll see if you would agree with this, I mean, or maybe you disagree with this.
We stage one of these every time.
I stage one of these all the time. No, we disagree about stuff. But, the idea that the revolution, maintaining the revolution, becomes the obsession for him. Slavery is put to the side, or solving that problem is put to the side. And it's those monocrats and those, would-be, counter-revolutionaries that he has to defeat. And this is a problem that will solve itself in another generation of people. We've done the revolution. Then the next phase will be to deal with this particular issue. It's no longer, when he was a younger person and he was, copying down in his commonplace books the, anti-slave trade stuff, and he thought that was being anti-slavery, and the things that David mentions as him working as a lawyer, that's his vision of how he is making a difference. Once he gets to the point where he's thinking that the new country has to deal with these questions, he says that this is something that can come later. Right now, we have to solidify this. We're obsessed with, I've said this a lot, we're rightly obsessed with the problem, with the issue of slavery and the issue of race, because it's something we're still grappling with today. We haven't solved this problem. But for him, it was really about keeping the revolution going. And it's not as important to him anymore. And you mentioned France, going to France, and part of the issue with the poverty and the extreme inequality is that, they've lived this way for hundreds of years. It's taken them a long time to get to the point where there's going to be, because he could see at the time, that there was going to be a revolution there. There were signs of that, coming down the pike. This is something that we can solve. It will be solved over time. And so he punts on it. So I think it's not a subject that he ever totally leaves, but it becomes much less important to him. Once they're in control of the continent, getting control of the continent and maintaining it is what really, really matters. And he thinks that slavery is something that's going to solve itself. Of course, we know what happened with that.
It didn't exactly happen. But I think your phrase, saving the revolution, I think that's critical. What does that entail? Because I think that explains or builds on your point.
Well, you tell me what it entails, other than being at war with everybody, with seeing enemies.
It is a kind of war. That's what I would say.
Yeah,
that is
very
ubiquitous
Manichaean
existential threats, internal and external. That psychology of being at war. Jefferson was once described as a halfway pacifist, which about covers it. I'd say less than halfway, 40%. Anyway, yes, the aspiration of people who make war is to win, and they see peace on that horizon. But there are so many vulnerabilities, and I think that's what we shortchange, that we don't recognize. We think it is a linear, progressive thing, and it had to happen. History having an arc and must go forward. The way Jefferson holds on to the idea that we won't, he's not Genghis Khan. He doesn't want to be a war leader. He wants to preside over, a peaceful world, you might say. But it has to be a peaceful world, and it's not. And the threats are, as I say, ubiquitous. How do you save the revolution? In some sense, you have to reenact it on what he sees as a generational basis. We talked a little bit about cyclical conceptions of history. In a way, his idea of generational sovereignty is to fold in the cycles into a progressive line forward. But every generation faces an equivalent, not the same, an equivalent crisis, and has to mobilize accordingly. Could you do that through peaceful means? Can you have it both ways? We've talked about tensions before, about unitary and federal. There are any number of ways you can talk about these fundamental tensions of, modern political societies, I'd say. Jefferson conceptualizes them in generational terms, and that's his solution. And that is, in some way or another, the dead hands of the past have to be removed. Stop throttling us, because that's the way he pictures let's say we talk about pathways forward, but he talks about the burdens we carry from the past. And that notion of reenacting the revolution, because one way or another, the system has to reboot. It has to be cleansed, as they say in theory, a return to first principles. How can that be done? How can you get people engaged the way they were in that primal moment of nation making? And you might say that it's a profound nostalgia for the founding as he understood it. And as he articulated on behalf of the American people in the Declaration of Independence, it was always exaggerated. It wasn't a mass united movement. It was always consent that was often coerced. It's a messy world. Complicated is the word du jour here.
Yep.
Well, no, I mean, yeah, I mean, and he's certainly, as a young man, back to the young Jefferson, I mean, his readings taught him or made him think that, I think it would make him think that a new generation of people, new things, new ideas, you could not trust people who did not, or who hadn't learned the new ways to be effective, to be people that you should listen to. So he always saw himself as someone who's forward thinking, a part of a generation, a new group of people who were thinking in a different way. And once he comes to the point where it matters, when there's a conflict, now's the chance to enact all of this. He could take those ideas and bring them forward.
The young Jefferson, indeed the mature Jefferson, formed by reading. And in many ways, the reading precedes socialization, formal education, in many ways. And as you are both describing this, what strikes me is the distinction between the formation you get through a shared print culture in the 18th century as a provincial in an Atlantic world. My hat tip to Patrick Griffin, the province, a distant province of a British Atlantic world, where you are engaging through consumerism and through reading. That's a different experience than being in a group. Sort of the junto, Franklin's group in Philadelphia, or a Paris salon, or the world of parliamentary life in London is a very different world from getting it through books. And so I think from what you were describing, Jefferson is formed by the book and by a reaction. You said class traitor, or he's an uncomfortable member of the Virginia gentry and is rejecting many of its preconceptions. Some of that rejection is coming from the books.
But yeah, and it's strange too. This is a person who spends, a good amount of his time, in surrounded by people who are largely illiterate, the enslaved population. I mean, and there's a story that Isaac Granger, Jefferson Granger, his real name is Isaac Granger, tells about Jefferson coming into his bedroom, his area there, and books everywhere open up. And if you ask him a question, if he didn't know the answer to it, he would go to a book. And so this is, just think of someone who's living that way and writing letters to people across the ocean or Madison or other places, but the day-to-day existence, other than visitors coming in, but for certainly the young Jefferson, before he becomes a great statesman, where everybody's coming there, is surrounded by people who are uneducated. And he is in the middle of all of that and has to, and live in that world where he is, his
so he's around
interlocutors
people.
are far distant places.
He is inhabiting a life, essentially a life of the mind, quite literally. He is around the enslaved who are illiterate and who are not engaged in that world, and his fellow gentry or other free whites are not engaged too much in that world either. So he is really in a world apart.
Right, and I think that's the great discovery to him, is that those high-sounding ideas drawn from books might apply to the real world. So I would just modify what you're saying, Will, in saying, yes, he reads a lot, and it's really important. It enables him to develop the rhetorical skills to then re-describe mob action. But it's the move from mediation to mobilization, and mobilization to mediation. It feeds on itself, and it doesn't become meaningful. It doesn't have an impact on the world, his world, until the boots hit the ground. I don't know, is that okay, Mike? Yeah, okay, I get the approval. We're trying to offer a different way of thinking about Jefferson, appropriate to the world that we've been introduced to this morning, that Jefferson, like Dickinson and other so-called patriots, are patriots before they're advocates of independence, and that's another term, we've mentioned that before. And I think that's crucially important. I'd like to throw out one other thing. He has misgivings about elite Virginians. He begins to think better about common folks so that he is responsible for that notion of, in Notes on the State of Virginia, of the virtuous yeoman farmer. Smallholders will rule the world. They're independent, they're not dependent on anybody else, and they represent the kind of wholesome lifestyle that generates real feelings of independence and autonomy. This is great material for creating an expansive republic. Of course, that's not Virginia. That's not what Virginians are like. But there is, I think there's a real attachment that Jefferson has. And when he imagines Virginia, he's talking about what Virginia could be. And he's focusing on the land. And I'd like to suggest that the focus on the land, we think it's that he's just some kind of back to nature agriculturalist, a hippie before his own time. I think he has a conception of the people emerging out of or in their relationship to their country. And I think that notion of country emerges well before independence. Because people talk about country in Britain, they're referring to their county. It's a loose protean term that can be applied in many different ways. But the country, the land, particularly when he looks westward and doesn't go there, that's crucial, because if you went west, you see, you'd see indigenous people, among other things, but you see semi-civilized white folk reduced to near savagery. But if in your imagination, I think this is maybe to complete the picture, it's Jefferson's imagination of what this place could become in the future, a country in which the thick attachments of families, nuclear families and friendship, the institutions they create, the roads they build, the country is not, it's not just nature in tooth and claw, it's nature as improved and improvable as he envisions it in the future. I think that's a sustaining vision for him.
What could be is an important phrase. Annette.
I was just going to say, and again, back to the point of the people, who can do this? Who can build a society like that? They're people who have to be alike. You have to be people who can be part of a family. The people who can, who can marry each other and have children together, that kind of thing. And so that poses a problem for him. And you just think of him there again, surrounded by 200 people of African descent, and maybe 7 or 8 other white people in this area. And he's thinking about this vision of a future, and that's so not where he is at that particular moment. It's a problem, and so black people, are a problem for him.
Yeah, I mean, we started with a Jefferson who reads too much, whose formative experiences then on the ground, observing the revolution, participating in the revolution. That's a Jefferson who's dealing with reality.
Oh yeah, and the people who leave, I mean, they're constructed as enemies when they leave with the British. Some. Not from Monticello, but from some of his other outlying farms. When they join the British Army, enslaved people go, and he says sometimes they're carried off, sometimes he says they leave with them, but that was a jarring thing for him.
But the homogeneity he was looking for was, at the end of the day, it was in his own time, for understandable reasons, racially defined.
Yeah,
didn't have to be.
No.
And that's, we're not selling Jefferson to you, but he's trying to sell us to ourselves in the sense of the notion of generational sovereignty is you too will have a constitutional moment. You too will be responding to mounting, accumulating crises domestically and internationally that threaten the experiment in self-government.
Well, crisis is a challenge, demanding a response, but it also opens all sorts of possibilities. My question with regard to enemies, Jefferson is at war. and that's an interesting formulation, at war with not just whom, but what. And this leads us to his agenda. I mean, he was not able to reform slavery, but there's an awful lot of other stuff in Virginia society that he took on. And I'm thinking of later, I mean, one of the points, I hesitate with two experts, but one of the things that Jefferson struck me as being focused on is the Virginia Constitution and Virginia's laws, not the Congress, not the Continental Congress, but it was in Virginia that the work had to be done.
Well, he thought that Virginia was going to be an example to the rest of the country, that it would be sort of like a mini America, and everybody would, a model place, and then other people could take the model along. Of course, he really
Didn't happen.
It didn't happen, and he, you always talk about him having New England envy, that it was really
Pennsylvania
envy, those kinds of things. Very funny. Those kinds of things, that kind of vision of what a society could be like. He looked to other places, but yeah, he wanted the Constitution. He wanted to create something that would be a model for other people, and never.
I just think of his reforms, and this again is leaning into a later period. But what did he do? Abolishing primogeniture, changing many entail, changing many rules, the disestablishment of a church, and all of these changes that were affecting revolution and taking the brakes off of the reforms he wanted, the changes he wanted, but also the things that Peter, particularly you, and have described that he disliked about the old regime, its dismantling.
I think the failure to write a proper constitution in his lifetime left him with a sense on his deathbed that the work wasn't complete. If you don't have a true constitution as he understood it on the Massachusetts model, then somehow you are not, you have not established the conditions for a people to govern themselves. The defect is baked in. And we'd say the defect is slavery, but he'd say no, it's the lack of the right kind of a true constitution. He thought of the Constitution as constituting the people constituting themselves on a generational cycle, and that's the precedent he wanted to set. Now we can say, oh, the spirit of it is this and that, but he was not satisfied, and there were a lot of things that were dissatisfying to Jefferson. Yes, he did achieve some things, that the founding of my great university, which was wonderful for me, and I'm grateful. Yes, he did these things, but there was so much work to be done, and maybe if you didn't get it right, maybe, he was famously dissatisfied with the Declaration of Independence. And in some ways felt that the editing, we don't agree with him, but the editing of that is responsible for the American Civil War. We could have gotten rid of slavery. Now, this is ridiculous, but it's that sense of achieving a kind of rhetorical, constitutional, get it right. And it's another way of expressing his frustration at the wrongness of the world. There is no getting it right. What he leaves us with, I think, and you could correct me on this, is the making a virtue out of his failures. And that is, what's finally necessary is what he recognized in his fellow Americans, and that is their willingness to commit themselves to the common cause, which is the foundation of state capacity. What he left was a testimonial to his faith that in the future, someday, we, his descendants, would do two things that are very important to him. Remember him as a faithful steward, doing the best he could in his time to pass on the estate entire and improved. A faith that the people could govern themselves across generations, never achieve perfection, but always struggle for it. And in the end, that is a legacy of this is a strange thing to say about a sort of Unitarian deist advocate of natural religion, but his legacy is a faith in Republican government.
Yeah,
Okay with that?
and the wisdom of people.
And the wisdom.
They would, if the situation demanded it, they would mobilize, they would rise up and do the right thing. Now, that's a little bit much to take, but that's what he felt.
Well, before we turn to audience questions, let me pose a question that you may have somewhat answered, both of you, is what sets Jefferson apart from other Virginians? That how is Jefferson, particularly young Jefferson, how is he different? This is and the differences, the factors that that make Jefferson's contribution to the cause of independence.
Mm-hmm.
How is he different from others of that Virginia world that was so important to the Revolution and the founding?
Well, I suppose seeing himself as a devotee of the Enlightenment, and also the kind of a sense of arrogance about his capacity to affect the world, to change things. I mean, he had an enormous sense of confidence in himself and his capacity, and he was going to do things. I mean, I think that's, you know, I think he saw himself early on as a natural leader, not a arrogance in a particular kind of arrogance, something that was, from his perspective, designed to help better the society, that he was going to make a change in society. And so I think that's, I can't think of anybody else who sort of thought that he was the person who was supposed to do all these things. I mean, he's just involved in everything. As a young man, he's, you know, doing editorials in newspapers or getting other people to do them, doing these kinds of things. And he's a person of action who doesn't want to be seen as a person of action.
That's an interesting tension. A person of action who does not want to be seen as a person of action. Because Jefferson was not an orator. He was not I could think of British and American figures who were great speakers. Patrick Henry, immediately mobilizing people. That's not Jefferson, or a figure like a Washington, a dynamic figure. But he was a man of a different kind of action.
Well, his abiding faith was in the possibility of collective action, spontaneous, and that's the way he wanted to think about the revolution. I think what's distinctive about him is that in so many ways he was not distinctive, that instead of going to Europe on the grand tour and just, expatriating, as a sensible person would do, he put dynastic imperatives first, that is, forming a family, establishing an estate, doing the things that Virginians did of his class. So when I call him a class traitor, it's because he is part of that class. And at the end of the day, his prejudices acknowledged that he was part of this world. What made him different were these ideas he clung to desperately. He testified to his opposition to slavery and his great plan of exportation, we call deportation, to the end of his life. But those things that made him different, he cherished in private. He didn't want people to know about his religious ideas. He developed an exaggerated sense of personal privacy and autonomy in which he could deny in a self-effacing way, I'm not out there making people do things. I want to help construct the machinery that will enable them to carry this burden, because we can't rely on a few good men. We can't rely on founders and framers. We have to rely on the people. And probably what drove him was a persistent concern that that's a false faith. It's obviously falsifiable in his own lifetime on the issue of slavery. But those differences he cherished in private. He couldn't be the enlightened man he wanted to be in the public life of Virginia in the decades before his death.
I know, and maintain any kind of sense of of power among his cohort. He had to keep a lot of things, as you said,
Yeah.
in private.
Well, with our two guests here, to our two speakers, I'd like to invite our audience to pose questions. Please come up to the microphone, and I'd ask you to speak into the microphone so that everybody can clearly hear.
Yes, this should be a popular mobilization and demonstrate your faith in us collectively by coming to the anxious bench and.
You'll have to forgive me if this was just a joke, but you mentioned that we don't really have natural rights. So I wanted to follow up on that.
That was for Michael.
Oh, if you were merely joking, forgive me. But I am curious to hear from both of you. So does Jefferson see is there a difference between young Jefferson or old Jefferson, that natural rights are a practical reality, or does he see them as something that, well, this is a shining light for the people to look up to, and maybe generationally they can one day aspire to it? And second question, does he see Sally Hemings as ever having natural rights?
Wow.
You want me to answer the first part?
You can answer you can answer the second part.
Okay, we'll switch roles on this.
No.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
She had natural rights. But natural rights are dead letters, so to speak, without the commitment to civil society. It's the two contracts, and that's an inadequate answer. And so I don't mean to impugn his sincerity and authenticity in helping Michael write his book. I'm cool with that. I think it's a useful discussion to try to put the idea of principles and natural rights into lived historical experience. Why do they get traction, and what do they mean in those various contexts? I leave it to you theorists to decide whether something that's trans-historical and abstract is real, or it has to be reinvented with every turn of the wheel. That doesn't really matter to me as an historian.
Let me add for our audience beyond the room right now that Michael is our very own Michael Zuckert, Professor Michael Zuckert, a distinguished political theorist and defender of natural rights.
And a good friend.
Patrick.
And a colleague of mine, too. It's wonderful to see you, Michael. Thank you both for this. And it's clear that when you put him in context, it makes us more appreciate all the more that Jefferson matters. And so what I loved is the way that you were both talking about, once you kind of understand that this is a man who had experiences, this is a man who was living in that murky world that we've been talking about, that's how ultimately to explain him. But instead of the things that he did or that he experienced, I'd like you both to talk about what he didn't experience and what that meant. Because when you think of two of his greatest achievements, one is going to be breaking away from Britain, the other, of course, is going to be creating an American empire in the West. This is a guy who's going to break away from Britain but never went to Britain. And this is a guy who's going to create an empire in the West and never went west. And I would imagine if he had been to Britain, for example, that he probably would have been overawed by a sense of grandeur, a sense of belonging perhaps to this place. I wonder what that kind of not being able to go, or the dog that didn't bark. Peter, you alluded to what's going to happen in the West, because he's not going to see the grittiness there. It's easy from your armchair to imagine breaking from Britain if you haven't been there. It's easy from your armchair to imagine the expansion of America West if you haven't dealt with the grittiness there. So I'd like to take a crack at that.
If he'd gone on the grand tour.
Absolutely. If
He
you'd
ends
gone on
up
the
in
grand
Britain,
tour,
but-
I mean, it's the counterfactual if you want to talk about that, but it's how does that, meaning the absence of doing these things, what does this tell us about this sort of world that you're recreating for us? Thanks.
Well, I don't know how much it would have changed him if he had gone on the grand tour and seen Europe and seen Great Britain before the revolution. I mean, he goes there when he's in France, and it's after the deed is done. I don't know that it would have changed things for him. I mean, I'm sure there were people who were who studied law, read law, and did things in Great Britain and were still revolutionaries after the fact. So it's not clear to me that it would have made that much difference to him. Do you disagree?
I'll disagree a little bit. Not going to Britain in his formative years,
Yeah.
when the protracted debate, if we want to call it that, when the imperial crisis was in progress, by not going, he was able to nurture Anglophobia that defined much of his career. And also hating England and exaggerating its faults and vices when, if anyone was aspiring to anything like an English way of life, it was Jefferson, a sophisticated cosmopolitan, would-be cosmopolitan. But it also provided a conceptual dumping ground for everything that was horrible, displacing his anxieties about his own world, about America, about the dismal swamp that was Virginia. So it enabled him to think in these, what we take to be characteristically Jeffersonian binary terms, to invert metropolitan contempt, to see in the vices of the New World the beginning of a new horizon of virtue. So I think that I love Patrick's question. It's a provocative one. Clearly, at the end of the day, the experiences that meant most to him were the home experiences of his own place, and that he wasn't willing to sacrifice.
So you think it would have made him? It's a question of degree.
Yes.
He would have hated. He would have hated England less than he
he's a
did.
hater.
Yeah.
And that in his world of hate, Britain represented he needed Britain. It was the great enemy, and of course his internal enemies were Anglophiles.
Yeah. And I'm struck in this context, the number of Americans, because Hancock traveled to London, Franklin spent extensive time in London. There were a number of South Carolina, wealthy Charleston planters, and Philadelphians. So across the 13 colonies, you had people who went across and were, to some degree or another, charmed by what they found.
Yeah, well, Jane's work on Dickinson suggests that was a formative period for him. It's a major thing to do, to break with the homeland and then to redefine your whole emotional geography in the ways that, and he did it in a more radical way.
But there is a point I would make is that often you say travel broadens the mind, sometimes it can narrow the mind. That when you go and encounter a different society, specifically with Jefferson, I would say some of his comments about France and about the Netherlands, and seeing, I think of John Randolph later on, another Virginian, who was just horrified by what he saw in Ireland. And so this can have a different effect.
I agree.
It's not necessarily, it's not that you're drawn into the charm of what you encounter, it's you're repulsed by it. Please.
Well, this is a true mobilization.
We're mobilizing.
I want you all to line up.
Okay, so this is actually a question from a colleague who unfortunately had to leave for professional reasons, which is why I have a note. But the question is specifically, what do you think of the theory that Jefferson may have injected the condemnation of slavery into the Declaration of Independence more in order to force Americans to acknowledge the travesty of slavery over criticizing the king?
Oh. So it's a message to Americans. It's possible. What do you think?
That the expurgated.
Yeah, the expurgated part. That it was a way to make a generalized statement about slavery, not just to, as a grievance, qua grievance.
I think it was a way of summarizing the dim beginnings of the first anti-slavery, which I think the latest scholarship is suggesting it deserves more respect than it gets. The wave of anti-slavery that maybe dies after 1790, but it was a genuine movement. By talking about the Maryland and Virginia efforts to limit importation. Yeah, no, I think that's very much to signal
Yeah.
that and enlightened Virginia. And Virginians took themselves terribly seriously. The South Carolina and Georgia are deeply irritating because they falsify from the get-go any idea that, well, we're on the verge of change here, aren't we?
So my question is about the world at war in
No, you're blinding. You're dazzling. You're dazzling.
So, I mean, a lot of what you've been talking about is a domestic world at war. You know, slavery is a state of war, the fear of the lower class, mobilization, civil war. But Jefferson also, I think, gives a lot of thought to international war and peace. And he lives through several phases. The period after 1763, people hoped it would be a peace that would really endure. And Britain's reforms, among other things, are supposed to secure the peace. But Americans see this as plunging them into a state of war. And the document that he writes in July of 1775, explaining the reasons for taking up war, he casts Americans as these peaceful people who had war thrust upon them. And then, we see the same thing in the 1780s, and after 1815, that's supposed to be a moment of peace. I wonder if you could just say a little bit about the international context that he's operating in, and does that have any bearing on...
Yeah, I think it does. And of course, what we're up against is the notion of the free security in the New World. We don't have any serious problems here, and they're all your fault. That's part of the Payneite analysis that Jefferson buys into. I will just remind you, Lige, that it's a friendly reminder, not hostile. Don't get me wrong. We're not at war. That the distinction between domestic and international is tenuous. And the great fears of an imperfect union is that it would quickly descend into a European style, a state of nature among independent states. That's always an imminent possibility, and it's the lens through which he understands broader movements of neighboring empires. The fact that the British simply do not evacuate the forts, that a whole litany of issues are not resolved in 1783. So the possibility of war again with Britain is continuous and is fulfilled. The possibility that the Union will fall apart, and I want to emphasize the word union as well. In those plans for intra-imperial confederation, the word of art is union. The word of art to describe treaties with foreign nations is union. I think it helps us understand the ubiquity of threats if we see that the terms and the realities the terms supposedly define are in flux. They're not fixed in the way we want and theorists want them to be. And I don't mean natural rights theorists, but I mean IR theorists historically. You just take the state as a given. Independence is a word that keeps floating around and has different valence in different contexts. So yes, if I knew what Jeremy knows, I would go on for about an hour and a half now. But it's a dangerous world out there.
So peace isn't possible.
Peace?
Peace isn't possible.
Well, the paradox of peace is that you have to secure it.
Yeah.
And in securing
It's
it,
possible for a breakdown of the peace. You have to work at it.
no, I'm all for peace. Don't get me wrong. I'm a lapsed Quaker. All right, just like Dickinson.
Thank you for this conversation. So there's been a lot of talk about natural rights, and that's most closely associated with John Locke. But in your conversation today, I kept thinking of Rousseau. Like there seems to be so much Rousseau and Jefferson and his faith and optimism in human potential, his desire to be unburdened by the conventions of the past. Even this collective action element reminds me of the general will, but a general will steered by an elite, enlightened, revolutionary vanguard, and also a general will that can reconstitute itself from time to time. So my question to you is, and Jefferson's a Francophile, so my question to you is Jefferson more Rousseauian than Lockean? And is there evidence that Jefferson read Rousseau? That's my question.
More Rousseauian than Lockean?
No.
No, I don't think so.
I'd say not. And not evidence that he had much, that Rousseau had much
Much
influence.
influence on it.
I think the crucial Lockean dimension is the question of legitimacy. Collective action that's precisely the imperative. But the way it's framed for patriots is that each patriot has to make the individual decision, has to consent, sometimes under the fear of coercion and consequences, to become part of this community. But the community remains legitimate because of, you might call it the social contract myth, because the individual is not dissolved in that community. And it's the free choices that people make about family formation and providing for their children that's the, I think, the motive energy of all this. Does that make sense?
Yeah. The question makes me ask two questions, related questions. One is, when were Rousseau's works published in America? Were they circulated in America? And also, were they in Jefferson's own library?
I think so.
I ask that because I don't know the answer to it. But those would be the publication history of those.
He was in France
all
that time.
Yeah, you had to be familiar with them.
He,
There's
he
no
was
question.
familiar with it, there's no question about it.
Right. And when, yeah.
Yeah, but I don't see him as Rousseauian.
I wanted to circle back and ask about a potential internal threat to Jefferson's idea of the revolution. And I think by the time of his presidency, and even by the Naval Act of 1794, he sees the military as somewhat of an internal threat to liberty. Is that something that predates the revolution? Is that something that comes about during the revolution? What is his relationship with the military's external role in externally protecting the revolution?
Well,
and
just remember, he's the founder of West Point. Well, that's not a sufficient answer.
No, it's not.
No, he shares the
Concern about
concern about standing
armies.
So he fantasizes throughout his life about nationalizing the militia. I mean, having an organization of the militia that would make it mobilizable. I mean, military people are saying, yeah, right, dream on, Jefferson. But he's acutely aware of the dangers of concentrated power. That's exactly what the American Revolution is all about in his eyes. That is the concentration of power in a distant metropolis. And the instrument or the tool of metropolitan power in this instance, but of despotic power generally.
Yeah, the tool of kings and monarchs, and that's how they rule.
I think in this sense, he had mixed feelings about Washington. They were good friends, though, Frank tells us. But what he did admire clearly about Washington is his stepping down from. That is an unheard of in the context. A military leader has the opportunity to seize power. I'm not sure that was true. He might have initiated an era of anarchy. But he did a great service to the Republic by not running a third term, by retiring from his role of commander-in-chief. And if there is one remaining bulwark of liberty in America, it is the deference of the military to legitimate civilian authority. Good luck with that, too.
There's another publication.
Joke about that.
Humor is still allowed. There's another publishing question that comes out of this, because there was a whole series of pamphlets and debates. And again, I think Patrick Griffin alluded to it in an earlier comment about militia versus standing armies. And the Liberty Fund, with which all of us on the stage and many of us in the audience are familiar, has published a volume of these pamphlets on the debate over a standing army as a threat to liberty. A man called Thomas Hollis made those pamphlets available in America. So I'm curious. I'm curious which of these, any of these, Jefferson might have read. And
Good question.
It's interesting, but also Washington. I go back to Washington. Washington despised militia because they were indisciplined, they were not efficient, and it's an interesting. So this is where we get to when the boots hit the ground, when the rubber hits the road, as the phrase goes. That when you had to actually operate, these ideas that sound good don't really work, and so this becomes the world in which Jefferson as well as Washington have to operate.
Well, Adam Smith was a better prophet. He suggested it's the hyper-specialization of the modern state, outsourcing sacrifice and risk because they're prosperous and they can do it. 1 minute. Yeah, should we negotiate it? How many seconds?
A last question. Any last questions from our
This is the chance of your lifetime. This is the last question.
Yes, Jack!
Oh.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh.
This one's for you, Annette.
I have to say I don't recognize the portrait of previous, the inheritance that Jefferson grew up with. It's not a Virginia I know about. The Virginia I know about is Richard Bland and George Mason and George Wythe and a whole lot of people. I mean, a lot of Jefferson's library now in the Library of Congress was from Richard Bland and also Landon Carter. I mean, what we know is a place which had an improvement psychology that was very different from the kind of old society that people have tried to make Virginia into. There certainly was generational problems, but the Byrd family, for instance, I went through 3 generations, and the last one gambled away his fortune. And there were a number of people like that in Virginia when Jefferson was growing up, but there were also a lot of other people.
No, I agree.
Like Edmund Pendleton, for instance, they're just a whole raft of people. It's not accidental that those 4 of the first 5 presidents were Virginians. That John Marshall was a Virginian. And it's not just Jefferson, or that Madison was a Virginian. That Peyton Randolph from the same family or a related family.
You could construct a generational history, and he could, of notable Virginians who he honored.
Yes.
And he wanted to fit himself into that.
Yes.
Yes.
Right.
I agree.
There is this business of legacy, works both ways. Somebody leaves something, but they begin with something.
Well, that is the takeaway of Jefferson's theory, is that you do leave something and you're honored for it.
Yeah, well.
And you're my mentor, and you left it, and I'm doing my best, all right?
I did the best I could.
Well, on that note, and thank you, Jack Greene, on that note, we will close another day of our first day of the conference. It's not a show without an audience, so I want to thank everybody here who's come out on a sunny Friday here in Tempe, Arizona, to join us for this program. We will resume regular programming tomorrow morning. So we have a panel lined up, and then we will close with an address by none other than Jack Greene. So thank you for attending. Thank you, Annette and Peter, for a lively conversation.